Hello everyone, today I will tell true horror stories about everyday life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I had always been fascinated by old houses. So when I came across a sprawling Victorian-era mansion listed for a surprisingly low price, I couldn't resist. The house was beautiful, with its ornate woodwork, stained glass windows, and expansive grounds. It needed some work, but I was excited about the challenge. After moving in, I immediately set about restoring the place to its former glory. The first few weeks were uneventful, filled with the sounds of hammering, sawing, and painting. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, I began to notice strange things happening around the house. One night, I was working late in the study, sorting through some old documents I had found in the attic. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Suddenly, I felt a cold draft, as if someone had opened a window, but all the windows were closed. I looked up and saw a shadow moving across the wall. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then, I heard a faint whisper, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. I decided to call it a night and went to bed, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling. But sleep was elusive, and I kept hearing faint footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I got up to check several times, but there was never anyone there. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of a child crying. The sound was coming from the nursery at the end of the hall, a room I had yet to renovate. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way down the dark corridor. As I approached the nursery, the crying grew louder and more desperate. I pushed the door open, and the room fell silent. The nursery was empty, but the air was thick with a sense of sorrow and despair. The crib in the corner looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. I was about to leave when I noticed a small, antique doll sitting on the rocking chair. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. Feeling unnerved, I closed the door and went back to my room. But sleep wouldn't come. The crying continued, echoing through the house every night. I was exhausted and on edge, constantly feeling like I was being watched. One evening, as I was making dinner, the power went out. I fumbled for a flashlight and made my way to the basement to check the fuse box. As I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped noticeably, and a foul odor filled the air. The basement was dank and dark, filled with old, forgotten furniture and cobwebs. I found the fuse box and managed to restore the power. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the basement, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a malevolent grin. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure slowly raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Panic surged through me, and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I locked myself in my bedroom, my heart pounding, and tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The next day, I called a friend who was a paranormal investigator. When he arrived, he brought a team with him and began to conduct a thorough investigation. They set up cameras, audio recorders, and various other devices throughout the house. As night fell, we gathered in the living room to review the footage. The cameras captured unsettling images, doors opening and closing on their own, objects moving across rooms, and dark shadows flitting through the hallways. The audio recordings were filled with eerie whispers and the unmistakable sound of a child crying. The investigator explained that the house had a dark history. In the early 1900s, A tragedy had occurred. A fire had claimed the lives of a young family, and their spirits had been trapped in the house ever since. The malevolent figure I had seen in the basement was believed to be the father, consumed by rage and sorrow. The team performed a cleansing ritual, trying to release the spirits and bring peace to the house. For a while, the activity seemed to subside, but the sense of unease never fully left. Eventually, I decided to sell the house, unable to bear the constant fear and dread. To this day, I still have nightmares about that mansion and the restless spirits that haunted it. I can only hope that they have found the peace they were seeking, but I will never forget the terror I experienced in that house. I had always been a skeptic when it came to the paranormal, but what happened during my stay at an old country manor changed that forever. The manor belonged to my late great-uncle, who had left it to me in his will. It was a grand, sprawling estate, but it had fallen into disrepair over the years. I decided to spend a few weeks there, hoping to get it back into shape for selling. The first few days were uneventful, filled with cleaning and minor repairs. However, on the fourth night, something strange happened. I was in the library, a room lined with dusty old books, when I noticed a particular book sticking out from the shelf. It was a leather-bound journal with no title. Curious, I opened it and began to read. The journal belonged to my great-uncle, and it detailed a series of disturbing events. He wrote about strange noises in the night, objects moving on their own, and a feeling of being watched. He mentioned a particular room on the third floor that he had sealed off, warning never to enter it. Intrigued and a bit unsettled, I decided to check out the room. I made my way to the third floor, flashlight in hand. The hallway was dark and cold, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I found the door easily. It was the only one that was padlocked. Against my better judgment, I pried the lock open with a crowbar and pushed the door ajar. The room was empty except for an old, ornate mirror standing against the far wall. The air was thick with dust, and an oppressive silence filled the space. As I approached the mirror, I felt a sudden chill, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My reflection looked normal at first, but then I noticed something moving behind me. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, I saw a shadowy figure standing directly behind me. Its eyes were hollow, and it reached out a skeletal hand towards me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the figure vanished. Terrified, I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I decided to sleep in the living room that night, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, I heard soft, dragging footsteps coming down the hallway. I lay still, clutching the blankets, as the footsteps grew louder and stopped right outside the living room door. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a cold draft filled the room. I sat up, my eyes wide with fear, and saw the same shadowy figure from the mirror standing in the doorway. It slowly glided towards me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the figure reached me, it vanished, and the room fell silent again. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, too scared to move. The next morning, I called a local historian to learn more about the manor's history. He revealed that my great-uncle had been involved in a tragic incident many years ago. A servant had died under mysterious circumstances in that very room, and it was rumored that her spirit had never left. Determined to put an end to the haunting, I contacted a priest to perform an exorcism. He arrived later that day and began the ritual, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water throughout the house. As he worked, the atmosphere grew tense, and a feeling of anger and sorrow seemed to permeate the air. During the exorcism, the shadowy figure appeared again, more clearly than before. It shrieked in fury, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The priest continued his prayers, and after what felt like an eternity, the figure let out a final, anguished wail and disappeared. The house fell silent, and a sense of calm slowly returned. The priest assured me that the spirit had been banished, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I sold the manor shortly after, unable to bear living in a place with such a dark history. To this day, I still have nightmares about that shadowy figure and the terror I felt in that house. I remain a skeptic of many things, but I now believe that some places are haunted by more than just memories. When I was in college, I spent a summer working at a remote mountain lodge. It was an old rustic place, tucked away in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The lodge had a rich history and was a popular spot for hikers and nature enthusiasts. I thought it would be the perfect summer job, offering a chance to escape the city and enjoy the great outdoors. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days tending to the lodge, helping guests, and exploring the surrounding forest. But as the summer wore on, strange things began to happen. One evening, after all the guests had turned in for the night, I was alone in the lodge, finishing up some paperwork. The only light came from the dim lamps scattered around the room, casting long, eerie shadows. I was just about to head to bed when I heard a faint, scratching noise coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some other animal, but the scratching continued, growing louder and more insistent. Curious and a bit unnerved, I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound. It led me to a door at the end of the hallway, a door I had never noticed before. It was small and unmarked, almost hidden in the shadows. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. A cold draft wafted up from below, carrying with it a musty, earthy smell. Against my better judgment, I descended the stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, stone-walled cellar. The air was damp and chilly, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty jars and old tools. But what caught my attention was the old wooden chest in the corner, covered in cobwebs. It looked ancient, its surface marred with scratches and age. Compelled by a mix of curiosity and dread, I approached the chest and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, I found an assortment of old photographs, letters, and strange artifacts. As I sifted through the contents, I discovered a worn, leather-bound diary. It belonged to one of the lodge's original owners, dating back to the early 1900s. The diary detailed the owner's descent into madness. He wrote about hearing voices in the night, seeing shadowy figures moving through the lodge, and being plagued by terrifying nightmares. He became convinced that the lodge was built on cursed land, haunted by restless spirits. One entry in particular stood out. It described a ritual he had performed in a desperate attempt to rid the lodge of its dark presence. He wrote about sealing something evil within the chest, hoping to trap it forever. As I read the final entries, a sense of dread washed over me. The scratching noise returned, louder than ever, echoing through the cellar. I glanced around, my heart pounding, and saw a shadow moving across the wall. I dropped the diary and backed away, my flashlight flickering. Suddenly, the chest slammed shut with a force that shook the floor. The scratching grew frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Panicked, I stumbled up the stairs and slammed the cellar door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in my room, too terrified to sleep. The scratching continued, muffled by the thick walls, but I could still hear it, gnawing at my sanity. The next morning, I told the lodge manager about what had happened. He listened quietly, a grave expression on his face. "The cellar has been locked for years," he said. "We don't go down there. Some things are better left undisturbed." I didn't need any more convincing. I packed my bags and left the lodge that day, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I never went back, but the memories of that summer haunt me to this day. I still hear the scratching in my dreams, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. I had just moved into a new apartment in the city. It was a small one-bedroom unit in an old building, but the location was perfect, and I was excited about the fresh start. Everything seemed fine at first, but then strange things began to happen. One night, after a long day at work, I came home, fixed myself some dinner, and settled down to watch TV as I was scrolling through channels. I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the walls. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or maybe the neighbors. But the knocking continued, growing louder and more rhythmic. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls, moving from room to room. I tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on the TV, but the knocking persisted. Frustrated, I went to bed early, hoping to get some sleep. I had just drifted off when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound had come from the kitchen. Cautiously, I got up and walked towards the kitchen. As I reached the doorway, I saw the cupboard doors swinging open and shut on their own. The dishes rattled inside, as if someone was furiously shaking them. I stood frozen in shock, unable to move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The cupboard doors slowly creaked to a halt, and the kitchen fell silent. Terrified, I backed away and returned to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I barely slept that night, every creak and groan of the old building setting my nerves on edge. The next day, I told a few colleagues about the incident. One of them, an older woman named Margaret, looked at me with a serious expression. "You should have the apartment checked," she said. "Sometimes old buildings have history." That evening, I contacted the landlord and explained what had happened. He was skeptical, but agreed to have a look. When he arrived, he inspected the kitchen and walls, but found nothing unusual. "These old buildings can be noisy," he said dismissively. "It's probably just the pipes." Feeling a little reassured, I decided to stay. But the strange occurrences only got worse. Objects would move on their own. Lights would flicker, and I often felt an icy chill, even when the heater was on full blast. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard whispering voices. They were so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to be coming from all around me. Desperate for answers, I did some research on the building. I discovered that it had been a hotel in the early 1900s. There were rumors of a tragic event, a fire that had claimed several lives, including those of a family staying in the very apartment I now occupied. Determined to find peace, I reached out to a local psychic. She agreed to come to the apartment and see if she could sense anything. When she arrived, she immediately picked up on the presence of spirits. "There are restless souls here," she said, her voice solemn. "They are trapped, unable to move on." She performed a cleansing ritual, attempting to communicate with the spirits and help them find peace. For a few days, the apartment felt lighter, the air clearer. But it wasn't long before the disturbances returned, more aggressive than before. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I looked up into the bathroom mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I moved out the next day, leaving the apartment behind. The landlord was angry, but I didn't care. The fear and unease were too much to bear. To this day, I still have nightmares about that apartment and the restless spirits that haunted it. I hope they have found peace, but I will never forget the terror I felt living in that place. I had always loved exploring abandoned buildings, so when I heard about an old, decrepit mansion on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. The locals avoided the place, claiming it was haunted, but I brushed off their warnings. I arrived at the mansion just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The mansion was a relic of the past, with broken windows and ivy crawling up its walls. The front door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, and I stepped into the dimly lit foyer. The air inside was stale and cold, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. I turned on my flashlight, illuminating the dusty, cobweb-covered interior. I wandered through the empty rooms, taking photos and marveling at the grandeur that once was. As I ventured deeper into the mansion, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. It was as if the very walls were watching me. I shrugged it off and continued exploring, my curiosity driving me forward. I eventually reached the basement door. It was heavy and covered in dust, but it wasn't locked. I hesitated for a moment before opening it and descending the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was pitch black, and the smell of mold was overpowering. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the damp walls. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a large, open space. Old furniture and broken appliances were scattered around, and in the corner, I noticed a small wooden door. It seemed out of place, almost as if it had been added later. I approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow, stone-walled tunnel. The air was colder here, and I could feel a slight breeze coming from somewhere deep within. I stepped into the tunnel, my flashlight struggling to pierce the darkness. As I walked further, I noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, their meanings unknown to me. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in a labyrinthine fashion. I began to hear faint whispers, barely audible over the sound of my own footsteps. My flashlight flickered again, and I felt a cold draft brush past me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could make out a few words. Leave, now. I quickened my pace, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking in the shadows. The whispers turned into anguished cries, echoing through the tunnel. My flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled to turn it back on, but it was no use. In the pitch black, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, but I could see nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I backed away, my heart racing, and felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my shoulder. I screamed and ran, the cries and footsteps chasing me through the darkness. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands and knees on the rough stone floor. The cries were deafening now, a cacophony of pain and despair. I scrambled to my feet and continued running, desperate to find a way out. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I felt as if I were running in circles. Suddenly, I saw a faint light up ahead. I sprinted towards it, the cries and footsteps right behind me. The light grew brighter, and I realized it was coming from an open door. I burst through the door and found myself back in the basement, the tunnel entrance slamming shut behind me. The basement was silent once again, the air still and cold. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to leave the mansion immediately. I raced up the stairs, through the darkened rooms, and out the front door. As I stood outside, gasping for air, I glanced back at the mansion. It stood silent and foreboding, the windows like dark eyes watching me. I never spoke of what happened that night, but I knew one thing for certain. The mansion was not just abandoned, it was haunted by something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. It was a cold winter night, and I was home alone for the weekend. My parents had gone out of town, leaving me in charge of the house. I was enjoying the solitude, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a good book. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wood floors. Around midnight, I decided to make myself a cup of hot chocolate. As I walked into the kitchen, I heard a faint sound coming from the living room. It was like a soft humming, almost like a lullaby. I froze, listening intently. The humming grew louder, more distinct, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I slowly walked back to the living room, my heart pounding. The room was empty, but the humming continued. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, where an old rocking chair sat. The chair was slowly rocking back and forth, creaking with each movement. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. The house was old, and it could be a draft, I told myself. Gathering my courage, I approached the chair. The humming stopped abruptly as I got closer, and the chair came to a halt. I reached out and touched the chair, finding it cold to the touch. I quickly pulled my hand back, feeling a chill run down my spine. I decided to ignore it and returned to the kitchen to make my hot chocolate. As I was pouring the milk into the pot, I heard the humming again. This time, it was louder and more eerie. I turned around, and to my horror, the rocking chair was now facing the kitchen, rocking more vigorously than before. Panic set in, and I grabbed a kitchen knife, clutching it tightly. I tried calling my parents, but there was no signal. The humming grew louder, filling the entire house. I could hear it coming from all directions, echoing through the walls. I decided to leave the house, but as I reached the front door, I found it locked. No matter how hard I tried, the door wouldn't budge. The windows were the same, sealed shut. The humming grew louder, almost deafening. I could feel a presence, something watching me, waiting. Desperate, I ran upstairs to my room and locked the door behind me. The humming followed me, growing more intense. I could hear footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. They stopped right in front of my room, and the doorknob began to turn. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The figure stepped into the room, and I could feel the temperature drop. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, staring at me. The humming grew louder, almost unbearable. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, and I knew I had to do something. I grabbed the knife and lunged at the figure, but my hand passed right through it, as if it were made of smoke. The figure began to advance, and I backed away, stumbling over my own feet. It reached out a hand, and I felt a cold, icy grip around my wrist. I screamed, struggling to break free, but it was no use. The figure's grip tightened, and I felt a searing pain shoot through my arm. Just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the figure suddenly vanished, and the humming stopped. The room was silent, and I was alone once again. The door was still open, and the house seemed to return to its normal state. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, clutching the knife, waiting for the figure to return. But it never did. When morning came, I packed a bag and left the house, unable to stay there any longer. I later learned that the house had a dark history. A previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances, and it was said that his spirit still haunted the place. I moved in with a friend and never went back to that house. To this day, I can't hear a lullaby without feeling a sense of dread, remembering that cold winter night when I was home alone. It was a stormy night when I found myself alone in my new house for the first time. I had recently moved to the countryside to escape the bustle of city life, and the isolation was a welcome change, or so I thought. The house was an old farmhouse, charming yet eerie with its creaky floorboards and ancient, sprawling layout. The power had gone out due to the storm, and I was lighting candles around the house to fend off the darkness. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old house groan. I settled into the living room with a book, trying to ignore the unsettling noises. Around midnight, I heard a soft, persistent knocking. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the knocking grew louder and more deliberate. It was coming from the back door. My heart pounded as I crept to the door, holding a candle in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the relentless knocking. Summoning my courage, I flung the door open, only to find the porch empty. The rain poured down in sheets, and there was no sign of anyone. I closed the door, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. As I turned to go back to the living room, I heard the knocking again, this time coming from the front door. My heart raced. It was impossible for someone to move from the back to the front of the house so quickly. I walked slowly to the front door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I hesitated, then opened the door. Once again, there was no one there. I stepped outside, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing except the storm raging on. Shaken, I locked the door and returned to the living room, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Suddenly, the air grew thick with the smell of something burning. I looked around frantically and saw smoke seeping out from under the basement door. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the flashlight and raced to the basement, throwing the door open. The basement was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The smell of burning grew stronger as I descended the stairs. I reached the bottom and saw an old furnace in the corner, the source of the smoke. It was as if it had been turned on. But that was impossible. I hadn't touched it since moving in. I approached the furnace cautiously, but before I could inspect it, the basement door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam flickering. I ran up the stairs and tried the door, but it was locked from the outside. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. Then I heard footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. Someone was in the house. The footsteps grew louder, moving towards the basement door. I backed away, my heart racing. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. A shadowy figure stood at the top of the stairs, backlit by the candlelight from the living room. It slowly descended, each step echoing in the confined space. I stumbled back, tripping over an old crate and falling to the floor. The figure loomed over me, its features obscured by the darkness. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure remained silent, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and malevolent. It reached out a hand, and I felt a wave of icy dread wash over me. Suddenly, the power came back on, flooding the basement with light. The figure vanished, leaving me alone and trembling on the floor. I scrambled up the stairs and burst out of the basement, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of the living room, all the lights on, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The house was silent, but I could still feel the presence, lurking just out of sight. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the house, vowing never to return. I told the real estate agent I couldn't stay there any longer. She nodded, a knowing look in her eyes, and promised to put the house back on the market. I moved back to the city, grateful for the noise and crowds. I never spoke of what happened that night, but the memory haunts me. Sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the knocking, relentless and insistent, and I wonder if the house is still waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. I had just moved into a quaint little house on the outskirts of town. It was an old Victorian-style home, filled with charm and character, perfect for someone like me who loved history. The neighbors were friendly, and the area was quiet, making it seem like the perfect place to start anew. Little did I know, my excitement would soon turn into dread. The first few days were busy with unpacking and getting settled. Everything seemed fine until the third night. I was lying in bed, struggling to fall asleep, when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It seemed to be coming from the walls. I told myself it was just the house settling. An old house like this was bound to make some noises. But the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. The next day, I decided to investigate. I checked the walls, the attic, and the basement, but found nothing unusual. I even asked the neighbors if they had heard anything strange, but they all shook their heads. That night, the tapping returned, more pronounced than before. It seemed to be following me from room to room, always just out of sight. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with all the lights off, listening. The house was eerily silent, the only sound my own breathing. Then, around midnight, the tapping started again. This time, it was accompanied by a soft whispering, almost too faint to hear. My heart raced as I strained to make out the words, but they were indecipherable. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound, which led me to the basement door. Taking a deep breath, I descended the creaky stairs. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old, forgotten items left by previous owners. The tapping grew louder as I approached the far wall. I reached out and touched the wall, feeling a strange vibration. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, and the basement was plunged into silence. I shone my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Just as I was about to turn back, I noticed a small, hidden door in the corner, partially covered by an old rug. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled the rug aside and opened the door. The door led to a narrow passageway that seemed to go on forever. The air was thick and musty, and the walls were covered in strange old markings. As I made my way down the passage, the whispering returned, louder and more urgent. The words were still unclear, but I could sense the desperation in them. At the end of the passage, I found a small, hidden room. The room was empty except for an old wooden chair in the center. On the chair sat a dusty, leather-bound book. I picked up the book and opened it, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes and drawings. The notes described a series of strange events that had occurred in the house over the years, all centered around the hidden room. The previous owner had been a recluse, obsessed with the idea that the house was haunted. He had written about hearing voices, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. He believed that the house was built on cursed land and that the spirits of those who had died there were trapped, unable to move on. As I read through the notes, the whispering grew louder, filling the room with an eerie, otherworldly sound. I looked up and saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and it reached out towards me with skeletal hands. I dropped the book and backed away, my heart pounding. The figure advanced, its whispers turning into a cacophony of voices. I turned and ran down the passage, the voices echoing behind me. I stumbled up the stairs and slammed the basement door shut, my body shaking with fear. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, too terrified to sleep. The whispering continued, now coming from all around the house. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air thick with an oppressive sense of dread. The next morning, I packed my things and left the house, unable to bear another night in that place. I told the real estate agent that I had changed my mind and wanted to sell the house immediately. She looked at me with a knowing expression, but didn't ask any questions. To this day, I still hear the whispers in my dreams, and I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I never went back to that house, and I warn anyone who will listen to stay away from it. Some places are haunted by more than just memories, and I learned that the hard way. I was a sophomore in college when I decided to rent an old house, off campus with a few friends. It was a charming, two-story Victorian home that had been converted into a rental property. The price was right, and we were all excited about the idea of living in a house with so much character. The first few weeks went smoothly, but soon strange things began to happen. It started with small, almost imperceptible events, lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own, and cold drafts in rooms with no windows open. We brushed it off as quirks of the old house, but things quickly escalated. One night, I was studying late in my room when I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was one of my roommates, but when I went to check, everyone was either asleep or out. I returned to my desk, trying to focus on my work, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like multiple voices, all speaking at once, but I couldn't make out any words. Terrified, I decided to sleep in the living room that night. As I lay on the couch, I heard footsteps upstairs. They were slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I held my breath, clutching the blanket, and listened. The footsteps stopped right above me, and I could feel the floorboards creak under the weight of whatever was standing there. Suddenly, the whispering returned, this time accompanied by a chilling sensation that seemed to seep into my bones. I could barely move, paralyzed by fear. The voices grew louder, now unmistakably coming from the stairwell. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, but the voices and footsteps only intensified. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed my phone and texted my roommate, Sarah, who was upstairs. "Are you awake? There's something in the house." She didn't respond immediately, but a few moments later, I heard her door creak open and her footsteps coming down the stairs. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice trembling. "I'm here," she replied, but her voice sounded distant and hollow. She appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear it too?" she whispered. We huddled together on the couch, too scared to move. The whispering continued, now seeming to come from all around us. Sarah's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it, her face turning pale. "It's a text from our landlord," she said, showing me the screen. The message read, "Just wanted to let you know. The previous tenant experienced some disturbances in the house. If anything unusual happens, please contact me." We spent the rest of the night in the living room, too afraid to go back upstairs. The next day, we called the landlord, who reluctantly admitted that the house had a history of paranormal activity. He mentioned that a previous tenant had performed seance in the house, trying to contact a deceased relative, and since then, strange things had been happening. Determined to find a solution, we contacted a local paranormal investigator. When he arrived, he conducted a thorough investigation of the house. As he walked through each room, he explained that the seance might have opened a portal, allowing multiple spirits to enter the house. The investigator performed a cleansing ritual, and for a while, things seemed to return to normal. But every now and then, I would still hear faint whispers and feel the unnerving sensation of being watched. Eventually, we decided to move out, unable to handle the constant fear and unease. The house was charming, but the terror it held within its walls was too much to bear. To this day, I can't walk past an old Victorian house without feeling a shiver down my spine, remembering the horrors of that haunted home. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was home alone for the weekend. My parents had gone on a short vacation, leaving me in charge of the house. I had always loved the peace and quiet of being alone. But that night, something felt off. I had just settled into my favorite armchair with a book when I heard a faint noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a soft thud, followed by a dragging sound. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to rationalize it. It's probably just the house settling, I told myself, though my gut feeling said otherwise. After a few minutes, the sound came again, louder this time. I put my book down and stood up, straining my ears to locate the source. The noise seemed to be coming from my parents' bedroom. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the creaky wooden stairs. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The hallway was pitch dark, and the only sound was the rain tapping against the windows. I took a deep breath and crept towards my parents' room. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, the flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. There on the floor were muddy footprints leading from the window to the bed. The window was slightly open, and the curtains billowed with the breeze. My heart pounded in my chest as I swept the room with the flashlight, but there was no one there. I quickly closed the window and locked it, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just an animal, I whispered, but I knew that didn't make sense. The footprints were too large to human. Suddenly, I heard the sound of heavy breathing behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam landed on the closet door, which was now slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed that before. My pulse quickened as I approached the closet. My hand reached for the door handle. With a swift motion, I yanked the door open and shined the flashlight inside. It was empty, but the clothes hanging there swayed as if someone had just brushed past them. Panic set in, and I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. In the pitch black, I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I screamed and bolted out of the room, nearly tripping down the stairs. I ran to the living room, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the house was eerily silent. They searched every corner, but found no sign of an intruder. The footprints, however, were real, and the officers looked as disturbed as I felt. I spent the rest of the night at a neighbor's house, too disenchanted to stay alone. When my parents returned, they were shocked by what had happened. We never did find out who or what had been in the house that night. All I know is that the feeling of being watched has never left me since.